In the quiet room, Maria stayed with Amara, determined to shield her from the chaos unfolding outside. But even as she reassured the little girl, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. And in those tense moments, as the lines between right and wrong blurred and the weight of consequences loomed, the seeds of karma were taking root. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the tension surrounding Amara's arrest rippled far beyond the walls of the police station. Calls were coming in faster than the department could handle, outraged parents, community leaders, and even journalists demanding answers. Videos of the incident had garnered millions of views, sparking debates about police conduct, systemic bias, and the fragile innocence of childhood. Inside the station, Greg Hansen sat in a stark interrogation room, his face blank but his mind racing. He had been pulled off duty for the rest of the day, ordered to stay put while his actions were reviewed. The reality of what had unfolded was starting to gnaw at him. This wasn't how he imagined his day or his career turning out. He had made mistakes before, sure, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes when you know you've crossed a line you can't uncross. Sergeant Williams watched Greg from the other side of the one-way glass, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had always been a man of principle, someone who believed in second chances, but never shied away from holding people accountable. And while he wanted to believe that Greg could learn from this, he couldn't ignore the undeniable damage that had already been done. Williams felt the weight of the community's anger pressing down on him, a stark reminder of how fragile trust could be and how easily it could be shattered. In another room, Maria Lopez stayed close to Amara, who was still clutching the teddy bear Maria had given her. The little girl was calmer now, but her eyes still carried the weight of confusion and fear. Maria had managed to reach Amara's mother, Shonda, who had been at work when the incident happened. The sound of Shonda's panic over the phone had stayed with Maria, a visceral reminder of how quickly a parent's world could be upended. Shonda arrived at the station not long after, her face a mixture of worry and determination. As soon as she saw Amara, she rushed to her, pulling her into a protective embrace. "Baby, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stroked her daughter's hair. Amara nodded softly, her small voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to see the balloon, Mommy." Shonda's heart broke at the simplicity of her daughter's explanation, but her sadness quickly gave way to anger. She turned to Maria, her eyes fierce. "What kind of person does this to a child? What kind of officer thinks handcuffing a 5-year-old is okay?" Maria placed a reassuring hand on Shonda's arm. "I'm so sorry this happened," she said sincerely. "I promise you, we're going to get to the bottom of it. I'm here to help in any way I can." But Shonda wasn't interested in promises or reassurances. She wanted answers, and she wanted justice. She had already seen the videos online, the way her daughter's fear was laid bare for the world to see. And now, as she held Amara close, she felt the fire of a mother's resolve burning inside her. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had grown larger. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "Protect our kids." Chants filled the air, their voices a united front against what they saw as an unforgivable abuse of power. Among the crowd were community leaders, clergy members, and parents who saw their own children in Amara's tear-streaked face. The atmosphere was charged, the energy palpable. Greg, still sitting in the interrogation room, could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside. It made his chest tighten, a reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. He thought back to the moment he had decided to handcuff Amara, trying to justify it to himself. She had looked so small, so harmless, but in that moment he hadn't seen her as a child. He had seen her as a problem to be solved, a disruption to be controlled. And now that split-second decision was unraveling his entire life. In the quiet room, Maria stayed with Amara, determined to shield her from the chaos unfolding outside. But even as she reassured the little girl, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. And in those tense moments, as the lines between right and wrong blurred and the weight of consequences loomed, the seeds of karma were taking root. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the tension surrounding Amara's arrest rippled far beyond the walls of the police station. Calls were coming in faster than the department could handle, outraged parents, community leaders, and even journalists demanding answers. Videos of the incident had garnered millions of views, sparking debates about police conduct, systemic bias, and the fragile innocence of childhood. Inside the station, Greg Hansen sat in a stark interrogation room, his face blank but his mind racing. He had been pulled off duty for the rest of the day, ordered to stay put while his actions were reviewed. The reality of what had unfolded was starting to gnaw at him. This wasn't how he imagined his day or his career turning out. He had made mistakes before, sure, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that comes when you know you've crossed a line you can't uncross. Sergeant Williams watched Greg from the other side of the one-way glass, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had always been a man of principle, someone who believed in second chances, but never shied away from holding people accountable. And while he wanted to believe that Greg could learn from this, he couldn't ignore the undeniable damage that had already been done. Williams felt the weight of the community's anger pressing down on him, a stark reminder of how fragile trust could be and how easily it could be shattered. In another room, Maria Lopez stayed close to Amara, who was still clutching the teddy bear Maria had given her. The little girl was calmer now, but her eyes still carried the weight of confusion and fear. Maria had managed to reach Amara's mother, Shonda, who had been at work when the incident happened. The sound of Shonda's panic over the phone had stayed with Maria, a visceral reminder of how quickly a parent's world could be upended. Shonda arrived at the station not long after, her face a mixture of worry and determination. As soon as she saw Amara, she rushed to her, pulling her into a protective embrace. "Baby, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stroked her daughter's hair. Amara nodded softly, her small voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to see the balloon, Mommy." Shonda's heart broke at the simplicity of her daughter's explanation, but her sadness quickly gave way to anger. She turned to Maria, her eyes fierce. "What kind of person does this to a child? What kind of officer thinks handcuffing a 5-year-old is okay?" Maria placed a reassuring hand on Shonda's arm. "I'm so sorry this happened," she said sincerely. "I promise you, we're going to get to the bottom of it. I'm here to help in any way I can." But Shonda wasn't interested in promises or reassurances. She wanted answers, and she wanted justice. She had already seen the videos online, the way her daughter's fear was laid bare for the world to see. And now, as she held Amara close, she felt the fire of a mother's resolve burning inside her. She wasn't going to let this go quietly. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had grown larger. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "Protect our kids." Chants filled the air, their voices a united front against what they saw as an unforgivable abuse of power. Among the crowd were community leaders, clergy members, and parents who saw their own children in Amara's tear-streaked face. The atmosphere was charged, the energy palpable. Greg, still sitting in the interrogation room, could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside. It made his chest tighten, a reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. He thought back to the moment he had decided to handcuff Amara, trying to justify it to himself. She had looked so small, so harmless, but in that moment he hadn't seen her as a child. He had seen her as a problem to be solved, a disruption to be controlled. And now that split-second decision was unraveling his entire life. Sergeant Williams finally stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. He set a thick file down on the table and pulled out a chair, sitting across from Greg. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them. "You've put us all in a bad position, Greg. Williams finally said, his voice low but firm. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm this has created? The department's reputation, the trust we've been trying to build with the community, it's all hanging by a thread because of you." Greg swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I didn't mean for things to get this out of hand," he said, his voice lacking the conviction he wished it had. "I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Williams shot back, his frustration breaking through. "What part of procedure says you handcuff a 5-year-old? What part of procedure says you ignore common sense and basic humanity?" Greg didn't have an answer. He looked down at his hands, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound hollow. Williams leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You need to understand something. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about every officer who wears this badge. Every time we go out into that community, we carry the weight of what you did. And right now, that weight feels unbearable." As the conversation continued, Shonda and Maria sat with Amara in another part of the station, trying to shield her from the chaos outside. But even in the quiet of the room, Shonda's mind was anything but calm. She was already thinking about what needed to happen next: calls to lawyers, meetings with community leaders, and the steps she would take to make sure Greg Hansen faced the consequences of his actions. Back outside, the protest showed no signs of slowing down. News vans lined the street, their cameras capturing every chant, every sign, every tear-streaked face. Reporters interviewed community members, their voices echoing the same sentiment: enough was enough. The story had taken on a life of its own, a symbol of a larger fight for justice and accountability. Inside the station, Greg felt the walls closing in. The weight of his actions, the anger of the crowd, and the stern disapproval of his colleagues all pressed down on him. For the first time in his career, he felt truly alone. And though he wouldn't admit it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered the truth he didn't want to face. Maybe he had been wrong. But the wheels of justice, public opinion, and karma were already in motion. And as the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that there would be no turning back. The night was heavy with silence, only broken by the occasional rustle of wind brushing against the windows. The clock ticked loudly in the dimly lit room, each second dragging on as if the world was holding its breath. Sarah sat at the edge of the bed, her heart racing. The events of the past few days replayed over and over in her mind. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. Something wasn't right. She had known it from the moment she walked into the abandoned house, and now, with every creak of the floorboards, it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. Outside, the storm was growing fiercer. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the very foundation of the house. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She had tried calling Jake a dozen times, but every call went straight to voicemail. She knew something was wrong. Jake was always there for her, always the one to keep her calm in moments like this. But now he was gone. She stood up, pacing back and forth, the tension building with each step. Her eyes darted to the shadows in the corners of the room, where she felt as if something was watching her. She tried to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger. The door creaked open behind her, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She spun around, but no one was there. The phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled it out. It was a message from Jake. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words, "Get out of there. It's too late." Her blood ran cold. What did he mean? Too late for what? The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her mind now. She could feel the tension building like a pressure cooker, the air thick with fear. Every noise, every shift in the house made her jump, made her wonder if she was truly alone. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to leave. But where could she go? The house, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. Her breath quickened as she grabbed her bag and rushed toward the door, her footsteps almost drowned out by the storm. She flung the door open, but before she could take a step, a shadow moved in front of her. Her pulse raced, her mind screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, her body refusing to move. The shadow grew taller, looming over her like some kind of nightmare. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorknob, only to find it jammed. Panic set in. She was trapped. The footsteps grew louder, closer now, echoing through the hallway. Sarah's mind raced for an escape, but there was no way out. No way to escape the feeling that something or someone was closing in on her. The air was suffocating, and with every breath, she felt herself being pulled deeper into the unknown. The shadow loomed closer, and just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a voice whispered from the darkness. "Too late," it said, and with those two words, everything changed. The figure before her shifted, its form becoming more distinct, yet still unnerving, tall, gaunt, and somehow wrong. The voice grew louder, almost as if it were right behind her, in her ear. "You shouldn't have stayed," it repeated, now sounding more desperate, like a warning she had ignored for far too long. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she spun around, trying to find a way out, but the room felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. Suddenly, the door behind her gave way with a loud groan, swinging open as though something or someone had released it. Her heart skipped, but before she could make a move, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The floor cracked, splitting apart in an almost unnatural way. Sarah stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror as the floorboards splintered and fell into an abyss beneath her. The house was falling apart, crumbling as if it had been waiting for her all along. The voice grew louder now, an almost desperate plea. "You're too late," it cried, but this time Sarah didn't hear it from just the shadow. No, the voice was all around her, echoing from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Something was wrong with the house, something much worse than she had ever imagined. She could feel the pulse of it, the presence that had been lingering in the shadows all this time. And then she realized, her mind struggling to comprehend it. This wasn't just a haunted house, it was alive. The realization hit her like a slap in the face, and she felt the weight of the truth crush her chest. She wasn't alone because something had been waiting for her here, something far older than she could have ever guessed. Her hand shot to her pocket, grabbing her phone once again, praying for some kind of answer, some salvation from the terror enveloping her. Her screen lit up, and for a moment, Sarah thought it was a sign. But when she saw the message, her stomach dropped. It was from Jake, just a few seconds ago. "It's too late. You didn't listen. It's already begun." Before she could process the meaning behind the cryptic message, a screech erupted from the hallway. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the entire house. Sarah's blood ran cold as the sound of scraping metal echoed closer. She turned toward the window, her mind racing, but it was too late. The house was no longer an escape. The shadow before her flickered, warping, changing, becoming something far worse. A creature, its long limbs twisting in ways that defied human movement. The lights flickered, casting brief glimpses of its jagged, inhuman form. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, the horror gripping her with an iron vice. But then, just as she thought she couldn't bear another moment, something else happened. The floor beneath her feet shifted again, the very foundation of the house groaning as if in agony. A new noise filled the air, one that was even more terrifying than the scrape of claws or the shadow's whisper. It was a voice, Jake's voice. He was calling to her, but it wasn't him. The voice was distorted, muffled, as if being dragged through the very walls. "Sarah," it rasped, breaking her name into a jarring, guttural sound. "You shouldn't have come." The storm outside now seemed to pale in comparison to the chaos inside. It wasn't just a storm, the house itself was alive with dread. It was as if the entire world was closing in, suffocating, spinning faster and faster around her, and Sarah couldn't tell where the nightmare ended and reality began. She staggered back, her mind racing for answers, but nothing made sense anymore. The tension had reached its peak. The room seemed to spin. With each passing second, it felt as if the very walls of the house were folding in on themselves, as if the house was drawing its last breath, suffocating her within its decaying grip. And then, as if orchestrated by some unseen hand, everything stilled. For a brief, terrifying moment, Sarah thought she might have imagined it all. Then, the ceiling above her cracked open with a deafening roar, and from the darkness, something reached down, its cold fingers brushing her skin. The coldness shot through her, paralyzing her. And just like that, the world went dark. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a long moment, Sarah couldn't tell if she was breathing or if her body had frozen in terror. Her mind raced, but everything felt distant, muffled, as if she was no longer in control of her own senses. Then, a sudden rush of air snapped her back to reality, filling her lungs with a desperate gasp. She was lying on the floor, the storm outside still howling, but the weight that had pressed down on her seemed to lift, just for a moment. She blinked, trying to focus. The creature, the shadow, was gone. The house was still, but that feeling of something watching her lingered, hanging thick in the air. She sat up, her hands trembling as she looked around. The room was eerily quiet, the cracks in the walls and floor now still, as if the house itself had breathed its last breath. Her phone, now in her hand, flashed again with another message from Jake. But this time, the words were different. "Get out. You're still here." Asterisk, it's not over, asterisk. The floor beneath her groaned again, a deep, unnatural sound. Her eyes widened, and she jumped to her feet, heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. Something worse. She backed away slowly, inching toward the door. But the door was no longer the escape it once was. The air was thick, the shadows stretching unnaturally toward her, as though they had been waiting for this moment. Just then, the house seemed to shudder, violently. The walls cracked wider, and through the gaps, Sarah could see the outline of something moving. The darkness wasn't just confined to the house. It was seeping out, pushing against the world outside. Panic set in as the realization hit her. The house wasn't just haunted. It had been a prison, a trap set long before she had ever stepped inside. She reached for the door again, but it refused to open. Her mind scrambled for answers, but everything she thought she knew about the house, about what had happened to Jake, was wrong. The truth she had been so desperate to uncover was right in front of her, and it was worse than she could have ever imagined. The house had been feeding on their fears, on their regrets, their sins. And now it was coming for her. Then, as if to seal her fate, the floor cracked wide open beneath her. She fell, plunging into the depths, into the unknown, her screams swallowed by the darkness. But just before she hit the ground, her body frozen in midair, a flash of light pierced through the shadows. A figure appeared, Jake, or at least someone who resembled him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he had been waiting here for far too long. He reached out toward her, his voice breaking through the darkness, calling her name. "Sarah, it's too late. We're both trapped here. There's no way out." For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed, staring into his empty eyes, her mind struggling to process the truth of his words. But then the final twist hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked down, and the ground beneath her wasn't the cold floor of the house anymore. It was the surface of a vast, endless void. She wasn't falling into darkness. She was already in it. The truth came crashing down. Asterisk, she had never left the house. Asterisk, the storm, the shadow, the strange occurrences. It had all been part of the house's trap, luring her back in over and over again. The house wasn't just a building, it was alive. And the people it had consumed, like Jake, was still trapped, part of its endless cycle. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and in that final, terrifying instant, the darkness swallowed her whole. And then there was nothing. When Sarah's body hit the ground, she expected darkness to swallow her whole, but instead there was an eerie silence. For what felt like an eternity, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her body was heavy, suspended in an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, with a gasp, she felt something, a pull, a tug that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. It was like a string pulling her back into the house, back into the nightmare she had tried to escape. She struggled, her hands reaching out, grasping at the void, but it was no use. The pull was relentless. The darkness around her shifted, revealing jagged shapes in the distance. She couldn't make sense of them. Figures, faces, lost souls. Their hollow eyes stared at her, as if they knew exactly what was happening. She tried to scream, but her voice didn't come. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, and then, in the distance, a light flickered. A small, dim light that grew brighter with each passing moment. It wasn't a hope, it was a warning. Sarah's heart raced as she recognized the glow for what it was, the house. It was pulling her back in. The walls, the floor, the very air of the house seemed to be drawing her in once more, as though it had never let her go. As though it had been waiting for her to make the final step. The world around her began to warp. The empty void started to twist, its dark, oppressive gravity fading into something familiar. The house, or what was left of it, materialized before her eyes. The walls creaked and groaned, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. There was Jake, his face hollow, pale, and lifeless. But now something was different. His eyes, once empty and lost, now looked directly at her with a mix of regret and sorrow. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking through the haze. "You were never supposed to come back. You never should have come back." Her chest tightened, the weight of his words sinking in. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was never meant to escape. She had been pulled into the house's cycle, trapped in a never-ending loop of terror and despair. Jake's hollow eyes told her the truth that she had been trying to ignore all along. She was part of something much larger, something that spanned beyond the walls of the house. The house wasn't haunted by the souls of the past. It was a live asterisk, a living, breathing entity that fed off the fear, pain, and regret of those who entered. It had consumed them all. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. "No," she whispered. "No, this can't be true. I have to escape. I have to find a way out." Jake's lips quivered as he shook his head, his voice a low, mournful sound. "There is no way out. Not for us. Not for anyone who comes here. You're just like the others now. You're part of it." A cold chill swept over Sarah's body. Her eyes darted around, desperate for an answer, for anything that could explain how to break free. But the house was silent, its shadows curling around her like tendrils, waiting for the moment to consume her fully. As much as she fought it, as much as she tried to scream, the truth settled in like a heavy weight. There was no escape. The house had always been the trap. It was never just a house. It was a force, a creation of darkness that lived and breathed through the pain of those who entered. It fed on them, twisted them into something else, something that would never be free again. Sarah's breath quickened as she realized that she, too, was becoming part of it. The fear, the regret, the terror that had flooded her soul from the moment she stepped foot into this place. It had all been part of the house's plan. But then, just as she thought the darkness would claim her completely, she heard a faint voice. "Sarah." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was Jake, but it wasn't. This voice wasn't the hollow, lost one that had tried to warn her. It was his real voice, the voice she had known before the house had taken him. "Jake?" Her voice cracked as she turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He stepped forward, his face now different, more human, more whole. "You can still escape," he said, his voice urgent. "I didn't want this for you. I didn't want you to come here. But it's not too late." The shadows around them trembled, as if angry at his words. The house seemed to react, shifting, twisting, the walls groaning in protest. But Sarah felt something else, something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt since she first entered. Hope. the small flicker of it that had refused to die. "How?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "How do I escape?" Jake took a deep breath. "The house, it feeds on your fear, on your doubts. It holds you here by making you believe there's no way out. But you've always had the power. You just have to face it." Sarah shook her head. I can't do this alone. I don't know how." "You're not alone," he said, stepping closer. "I'm here. We all are. But you have to face the truth. You have to let go." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure if she could truly believe what he was saying. The house was closing in on her again, the pressure suffocating, the shadows closing around her like a vice. But then, in a moment of clarity, she understood. It wasn't about escaping the house. It was about releasing the fear, the guilt, the pain she had been holding onto all this time. With a deep breath, she let go. The darkness around her began to recede. The house groaned one final time, its walls shaking as the pressure lifted. Sarah felt the weight of the past, the weight of everything she had feared, slip away. The house wasn't just a trap. It was a reflection of her own mind, her own struggles. She had been living in fear, running from herself. But now she was free. The house was no longer the threat. The shadows dissipated, the light from outside breaking through the walls. And in that moment, Sarah understood the true meaning of freedom. It wasn't about running away. It was about facing the darkness within and letting go. Jake smiled at her, his form fading into the light. "You did it," he whispered. "You're free." With a final breath, Sarah stepped out into the light, leaving the house and its nightmare behind. The storm had passed, and though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing: she was finally free.